I'd like to take a minute to thank everyone and introduce Dr. Bangor. Dr. Kaleigh Bangor is lecturer of German Studies and coordinator of German Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. She received her PhD in German literature with a certificate in Women and Gender Studies from Vanderbilt University in 2018. Dr. Bangor's research interests focus quite a bit on 20th century Austrian and German literature and culture. Her first book traces Joseph Roth, a very, very great writer, his journalistic writings between 1919 and 1939, and especially on his focus on the policing of marginalized communities, especially Jews, refugees, and other minorities throughout Europe. If I might digress for a second, I see Miriam Burdett here, one of our regulars. We were talking about Stefan Zweig yesterday, and Die Welt von Gestern, the world of yesterday, and Buchmendel, and certainly this is the same thought world in many respects as Joseph Roth. Dr. Bangor has already assembled a very impressive publication history, and since there is just about nothing more boring than reading off a scholar's many publications, I'm going to skip that part and just say that she's written on quite a few things, including today's main figure, Hannah Arendt, who I was looking this morning, re-looking at my portable Hannah Arendt, which we all carry around with us, diligently if we're interested in intellectual history. And I understand in 1951, when she became a American citizen, she also published The Origins of Totalitarianism, whose first part is a very important analysis of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure if that's exactly what Dr. Bangor will speak about, but I think it's fair to say that of the many important figures who came out of what's sometimes called the Weimar Renaissance, she is certainly one who not only still bears reading and rereading, but actually managed to establish herself very significantly among a second group of important intellectuals, the New York intellectuals, who were both deeply admiring of Hannah Arendt and also somewhat terrified of her, because frankly, she was much better educated than most of them. And in any event, it's wonderful to hear more about Hannah Arendt always, and it's especially wonderful to hear from one of our newer and highly talented professors. And with that, it's my pleasure to mute myself and to turn it over to Dr. Kaleigh Bangor.
Hi, thank you, Alan. Thanks everybody for attending. I think this is quite the turnout here. I'm a little, just slightly intimidated. I'm not gonna lie. I thought Zoom would sort of ease that, but no, still hasn't. So I think with all the anxiety of the election as well, it's kind of, I feel a lot of pressure. So bear with me, I guess you could say. And pressure also because of the subject matter and maybe the importance of the subject matter that I'm about to talk about, which is predominantly anti-Semitism, but I want to sort of forewarn you that it's a lot about non-anti-Semitism as well, or it's not necessarily entirely about anti-Semitism, but about other factors and other things that have been associated with anti-Semitism perhaps. And it's also about this presentation to me is the importance of making distinctions in dark times, if you will, as Arendt called them in a later essay. So yeah, I have a PowerPoint, but I have found that sharing a PDF of the PowerPoint is a little bit better via Zoom. I don't know how that might work for everyone, but I'm going to do that. I can share my screen, right, Alan? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to...
I'm sure Trice has made you a co-host.
Yes,
So now
yes,
share
you are.
your
Excellent. Excellent. Let me do one thing here. There we go. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about Hannah Arendt and anti-Semitism. And that's actually a very, very large topic that people have talked about, like Heidegger and her relationship with Heidegger, maybe far too much, but not in very concrete terms. So that's sort of the main goal of this talk today, is to talk about anti-Semitism in its concreteness and why that's important. I've included here, when you just Google anti-Semitism today, you find this version, this spelling of anti-Semitism, and the following definition: hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. And you see here two variants, or less commonly anti-Semitism, here as sort of a non-hyphenated term. And yeah, the hyphen might be something small, something little, but it kind of symbolizes for me the state of the understanding of anti-Semitism today, which is still this very broad, large thing. And I would say that, what we're going to talk about is this form of anti-Semitism over and against the anti-Semitism with a hyphen. And this is a really important distinction to Hannah Arendt, as are all distinctions, but we'll get to that in a second. So why is this distinction important to Hannah Arendt? Predominantly because in her first volume of The Origins of Totalitarianism, she is concerned with anti-Semitism, broadly defined. And in order to concern herself with that, she has to make certain distinctions about what kinds of anti-Semitism arise throughout history, and how anti-Semitism becomes then the central or the core of the ideology associated with the National Socialist movement in Germany, the Nazis. So, what she says here is sort of nicely and concretely summarized by Jerome Cohn in the preface to the Jewish Writings, which he edited and republished some of Ron Feldman's work that had been put out in 1975, 76 after her death. And as he explains that here, I'm not going to read all these quotes, I'm just sort of going to talk about them and highlight a few things. Anti-Semitism, this hyphen signifies something that is Semitic is something, or Semitism is something. And for Arendt, this was not, as this was never an ideology or movement. So it was always already a linguistic term, which I find, as someone working with language, to be very important, insofar as, if you're anti something, then you need to be clear about what you're anti against, right? Or maybe you don't want to, and that's the purpose. So, and this is found in a footnote. It's the second footnote in the introduction to the long essay on anti-Semitism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these two versions of this book, or this volume, which is also really important. And this version of anti-Semitism, the long essay on anti-Semitism, is actually something she wrote in German in 1938 and 39. And it was more of a history of anti-Semitism. And that's a really important distinction over and against what later becomes the volume in more of a political historical treatise on totalitarianism. So this long essay on anti-Semitism, in a small footnote, she writes, Semitic, like Indo-Germanic, was linguistic term before it became an anthropological and ethnic one. Only in the last third of the 19th century was the ideological catchword anti-Semitic coined and applied to Jews in general. the point is that there was never an ideology or movement called Semitism, which makes anti-Semitism and its cognates logical misnomers, which, you know, just going about and kind of correcting things for actual anti-Semites is something that I find kind of funny, if you will. But it shows how closely she's paying attention to this and how much distinctions mean to her, and that's why this is important. So where does Arendt write about the question of anti-Semitism? Some of these questions are some of the central questions of her thinking, and I'll explain why in a minute here too. That's sort of the point of my presentation. But she talks about anti-Semitism explicitly in the Origins of Totalitarianism, and not just in the first volume. So I'll get to that in a second. And like I said, the Jewish writings, which was edited by Jerome Cohen and Ron Feldman, they include the long essay on anti-Semitism, which she conceived of as more of a historical undertaking to sort of historically go through. And this is sort of combined then with more political arguments in the Origins of Totalitarianism. But this initial writing in German in 1938 and 39 had a very different tone, which is very important because, of course, the final catastrophe, as she calls it, the final solution didn't happen yet. She didn't know about that yet. So it's very, very different in tone. And it's also very interesting to compare these two works, because I think for historians, or what historians have told me at least, when you work with figures who sort of in the midst of everything tried to write about what was going on and tried to understand things, not in hindsight necessarily, but when you catch people writing in the midst of things happening, it can provide a very different insight into the time. And so that's where the difference in tone will come from. But today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the origins of totalitarianism and the questions of why are Arendt's categories of anti-Semitism important. And here, just if you start just with her outline here, you can see that there are different categories. Anti-Semitism, we have Jews, we have early anti-Semitism, we have leftist anti-Semitism, first anti-Semitic parties, and then later on, there's going to be all of these sorts of factors, all of these different categories of anti-Semitism sort of come into play throughout the second chapter and the last chapter on the Dreyfus Affair. And just to give an overview of this volume for everyone, well, it helps, I guess, to start with maybe the understanding that, spoiler alert, anti-Semitism isn't necessarily the driving force of Nazism. And this was so important to her because it was important to her to understand what was the driving force of Nazism, and in order to prevent it, as she later talks about. This was a very sort of pressing thing that, you know, understanding this correctly meant that, you know, things could be done perhaps to prevent this happening again, which at least was her impetus there. And so again, and the impetus too of distinctions often gets Hannah Arendt into trouble, and making these distinctions too, she often comes across as well, anti-Semitic in her own right? Like this would come out later, especially in the writing when she did the report on Eichmann in Jerusalem. And this tone and this sort of frustration, I think, with what anti-Semitism is and isn't sort of came out in that later text too. And in that tone, it was really unfortunate, which, you know, she had talked about afterwards. But I feel like if you read the first part of anti-Semitism and then read Eichmann in Jerusalem, there's something there that sort of culminates, and you can almost say, I would claim that you could say that this part one, all of these sort of categories of anti-Semitism then come up again in the report, and they come up in all the different sort of national flavors of anti-Semitism, and most importantly to the anti-Semitism that was so specific to the Nazis and the Nazi officials. So just to reiterate, why are distinctions important, and why did she do all this categorization of anti-Semitism? This is, I think, a really apt time to talk about this particular matter, aka the dark times. I think, as Richard Bernstein put it in a recent book, Why Read Hannah Arendt Now? You know, he says here, it's hard to resist the conclusion that we are now living in dark times that are engulfing the entire world. It's hard to resist that. But what Arendt meant by dark times is also not necessarily the atrocities of the 20th century, which might, people might just assume. But the dark times is something that she later says in 1968, in Between Past and Future, and also in Dark Times, Men in Dark Times, is that it is the function of the public realm to throw light on the affairs of men by providing a space of appearances in which they can show, in deed and word, for better or worse, who they are and what they can do. Then darkness has come when this light is extinguished by credibility gaps and invisible government, by speech that does not disclose what it sweeps under the carpet, but exhortations, moral and otherwise, that under the pretext of upholding truths degrade all truth in meaningless triviality. So this light that, this is really, really important, and the light is actually making distinctions for Hannah Arendt, and sort of understanding what all is at play in order to not generalize things and not sweep anything under the carpet, under the rug. For anti-Semitism in particular, these distinctions are important because when she went through this process, when you read this volume, you see how she came to very critical thoughts, basically thoughts that would later influence the rest of her work too. And one is the breakdown of the political concerns into social ones. And this is also something that, when you break down the political concerns into social ones, means you also have to break down the political anti-Semitism and social anti-Semitism and separate them out in order to sort of make sense of what's going on. And this, I think what was so pressing to her was that she saw in a society, in hindsight, in this version, that there was some ignorance on the part of the Jewish community, the European Jewry, to sort of do this work or to see this. And it's not necessarily that she blames people for this, but she's sort of in hindsight looking back and saying, okay, this needs to be taken more seriously. It needs to be you need to dive into it and sort of examine what's going on. And she says this too, for more than 100 years, anti-Semitism had slowly and gradually made its way into almost all social strata in almost all European countries until it emerged suddenly as the one issue upon which an almost unified opinion could be achieved. And this slow and gradual process is the process that she describes in both versions of her work on anti-Semitism. And she goes into sort of great detail about this, and she relies on many thinkers and also personalities or people that make appearances, because as she said here, those are the people for whom you can sort of judge whether or not something is in darkness or in light too. So when you see it play out on this stage, that was her feeling. And so again, why are her categories of anti-Semitism important today? I found this is the first 2 paragraphs of Anti-Semitism, the preface to the first volume. And I find it very striking. So in 1951, she publishes, "Many still consider it an accident that Nazi ideology centered around anti-Semitism and that Nazi policy consistently and uncompromisingly aimed at the persecution and the final extermination of the Jews." Every time I read that, I think, wow, that is not the concept that we find ourselves in. I think we can agree on that. I find that this is actually turned upside down. And I find that far from an accident, I don't know, today I would say that many consider it sort of the defining factor of Nazi ideology. It is a large part anti-Semitism, and not just anti-Semitism, but the hatred of Jews, hatred of Jewishness, which hatred of the Jewish religion. All of these things, there's sort of all of these social discriminations are sort of part and parcel of what I think if you asked many of our students today, or just many people in general today, that this is not the case anymore. And so for me, this means for me, like, going back and sort of understanding these concepts are of critical importance, because it's sort of turning itself around to a pre-Nazi ideology time, where the scapegoat theory, where all of these different sorts of theories as to why the Nazis didn't or hated the Jews, persecuted and eliminated the Jews, are all not found in, are all basically assumptions. So, and the other thing too is that I feel that we have a sense today of, maybe this is just in the current moment, but the sense today that, things need simple answers. There is a tendency today to sort of want to have simple answers for things. And I think that Arendt is important to remind us that, as she states here, this is all from Anti-Semitism, general trends, like the coincident decline of the nation state and the growth of anti-Semitism, can hardly ever be explained satisfactorily by one reason or one cause alone. And I think that sort of, that's really important to keep in mind, and seems very basic, but it also just seems very important to reiterate currently. And again, to reiterate, her point here is that on the one hand, you have Jews that seem to be, the anti-Semitism that seems to be sort of the central ideology, and also on the other hand, the sentiment that many people think that anti-Semitism is an accident. And so she, she talks about all of this sort of understanding this general sentiment as common sense. And she says, you have to refute those recommendations of common sense which lead us to believe that violent hatred or sudden rebellion spring necessarily from great power and great abuses, and that consequently organized hatred of the Jews cannot be but a reaction to their importance and power. So this sort of equivocation and common sense, like, oh, this must be really important, they must hold a lot of power, that's why they were against it. Sort of, this is one of the great, what she calls herself, she calls it the paradoxical plane of truth. It's one of those paradoxical planes of truth that so frequently come up in Hannah Arendt's thought, and I think is one of the reasons why it makes it so enlightening, is because she operates with these paradoxical, or what she believes to be paradoxical truths. So again, and why are these distinctions important today? As I've summarized, but here she says, it's important because it's central for her that all people, including all people of society, especially Jewish people, that they understand what's at stake. And to understand what's at stake, you have to sort of be able to understand the difference between social status and political status, which is really important for her. And to understand that, then you have to, on top of that, have to understand, okay, what form of anti-Semitism am I facing here, and at what severity? And this is something that she saw, that the emancipated Jews of her time couldn't understand that more was at stake in the Dreyfus affair than mere social status, if only because more than mere social anti-Semitism had been brought to bear. So here, I'm not going to get completely into the Dreyfus affair too much, but this is the first time that more than social anti-Semitism was more than social anti-Semitism was used for political aims. And this, she calls it the insoluble mixture of political motives and social elements. And these are the things that she also calls subterranean, these sort of social elements, and she sees them sort of hiding. This is what she was talking about when anti-Semitism grew slowly and gradually, and then all of a sudden was sort of employed for political purposes. And this is something that I think is what comes out of her study of anti-Semitism, is one of the first and most important times when she distinguishes these political motives and social elements, and what's at stake when we lose the distinction between politics and the social realm. So basically, again, I'm not talking today essentially about her different categorizations of anti-Semitism, but rather getting more to the point of which ones are susceptible to be politically motivated. And that's the anti-Semitism specific to the pan movements. And so she writes, the clue to the sudden emergence of anti-Semitism as the center of a whole outlook on life and the world, as distinguished from its mere political role in France during the Dreyfus affair, or its role as an instrument of propaganda in the German Stoker movement, lies in the nature of tribalism rather than in political facts and circumstances. The true significance of the pan movement's anti-Semitism is that the hatred of the Jews was, for the first time, severed from all actual experience concerning the Jewish people, political, social, or economic, and followed only by the peculiar logic of an ideology. So this is something that's still pretty, I would say, a bold claim too. And this, I think that this pan movement anti-Semitism is something that is in fact new, and I think that other scholars have pointed out the importance of the newness of the pan movement anti-Semitism. But I think that what I'm leaving out here is the entirety of the anti-Semitism volume talks about the atmosphere in which this happened. And the atmosphere in which this happened, there's all these other types of swirling, sometimes she calls them just competing anti-Semitisms, actually. And so this pan movement anti-Semitism is the thing to watch out for. And the reason for that is because of the quote unquote enlarged tribal consciousness as the emotional motor of the pan movements was fully developed before anti-Semitism and actually became the central issue. And what made then the addition of sort of the pan movement, the pan-Germanic movement, the pan-Slavic movement, this movement to unify all of these racial peoples. What made anti-Semitism of the pan movements, as she writes here, so effective is that it could survive the general decline of anti-Semitic propaganda during the deceptive quiet that preceded the outbreak of the First World War. And this is a very long kind of so I'm going to stop right there. And this is what she talks about prior to, in her sort of 18th, 19th century analysis of anti-Semitism. She talks about the rise and fall of the different forms of anti-Semitic propaganda, the different types of social discrimination, the different personalities, the Jewish relation to the state, what that all means. She sort of sets that all up in the beginning in order to sort of explain that there are these different forms of anti-Semitism, and this one wasn't any different necessarily, but it was different insofar as it was tied to this pan-Germanism, pan-Slavism. And then, so this merger with quote unquote tribal nationalism of Eastern Europe, that's what made the defining factor of anti-Semitism kind of come alive for political motives. And she says, furthermore, the reason why this was so, why we could just put it together, there existed an inherent affinity between pan movements theories about peoples and the rootless existence of the Jewish people. It seemed the Jews were the one perfect example of a people in the tribal sense, the organization, the model, the pan movements were striving to emulate. Their survival and their supposed power, the best proof of the correctness of racial theories. So not only is anti-Semitism sort of the prime for tribal propaganda, but it's also sort of the form in which you have a race war. And this is what she talks about also a lot in the second volume on imperialism in particular. But pan tribal anti-Semitism is not the same as Nazi anti-Semitism. So here is where sort of we have this backdrop of all these different social discriminations. We also have political discrimination in the form of whether Jewish peoples or families were emancipated or not, or given certain privileges over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. And then we also have specific political anti-Semitism in the turn of the century, the early 1900s, especially in Austria and Germany, where you have this sort of, especially in Austria, she claims, and in France, but in Austria in particular, you have this sort of these anti-Semitic parties. But these parties are just made them more willing to sort of join the Nazi version of anti-Semitism. But this is very important. The Nazi version is quite different. So she says, among a host of competing anti-Semitic groups and in an atmosphere rife with anti-Semitism, Nazi propaganda developed a method of treating this subject which was different from and superior to all others. Nazi slogans aren't new, as she says, but the only new element was that the Nazi party demanded proof of non-Jewish descent for membership, and that it remained extremely vague about the actual measures to be taken against Jews once it came to power. And so this, as she sort of later summarizes, Nazi propaganda was ingenious to transform anti-Semitism into a principle of self-definition and thus eliminate it from the fluctuations of mere opinion. And these fluctuations of mere opinion are sort of what she finds in sort of a leftist, monarchist anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, to a certain extent. It uses the persuasion of mass demagoguery only as a preparatory step and never overestimated its lasting influence, whether in oratory or in print. So this is also something that she ascribes to Nazi ideology, and she doesn't necessarily say that it was in this form of Nazi propaganda was ingenious. It's not necessarily a conscious ingenious. just to be clear. Sometimes she also says whether or not they were aware of it, this is what they centered on. This is also true of, in the Dreyfus Affair, with the Jesuits who found, or she claims the Jesuits in the late 19th century to be the first to understand that, you know, you can couple your ideologies with anti-Semitism to sort of arouse the masses and arouse the mob. And later on, within Nazi anti-Semitism, there is also another version of what she calls scientific anti-Semitism, and she doesn't talk about this I mean, she doesn't talk about it explicitly, but except for the fact that the planned shapelessness of the totalitarian movement of National Socialism is something that is really critical to her understanding of totalitarianism, because, you know, you can continue, the power continues, and you have all these different ways in which, you know, one authoritarian dictator can sort of exert power. And so that way it's shapeless, but it's also planned. And this is also just a little side note that basically the scientific anti-Semitism would be pretty interesting to sort of, a history of that has been done. But I would say too that she found this sort of, this idea for the shapelessness of totalitarianism in scientific anti-Semitism is yet again just another way in which thinking about anti-Semitism in these concrete terms led her to sort of see different factors that were important for larger understanding of totalitarian movements. And lastly, one of the most important things about anti-Semitism too is it's kind of the transition state between, you know, the Jews as enemies for National Socialists and the objective enemy for National Socialists. And this is really important to, because that's how these regimes function. And that's also something that I would say too is sort of the second thing that our general public might understand about the Holocaust and about National Socialism is, on the one hand, they hated Jews, and on the other hand, they also hated all these other people. Sorry, that's not funny, but these two balancing factors sort of are indicative of what Arendt is talking here, and that anti-Semitism led to the notion of the objective enemy and totalitarian Nazi propaganda. And she says here, too, if it were only a matter of hating Jews or bourgeois, the totalitarian regimes could, after the commission of one gigantic crime, return, as it were, to the rules of normal life and government. As we know, the opposite is the case. So it's about this supranatural force, as she calls it, this supranational drive to go beyond nationalism, which was another one of these paradoxes of National Socialism, was that its nationalism was actually a supranationalism. And this was something too that was critical when anti-Semitism is taken up by political movements. So this is also something where, you know, she talks also about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union over and against in the German territories and the occupied territories that they continue to occupy, and talks about sort of like the differentness between totalitarianism or Soviet totalitarianism and Nazi totalitarianism. And so this is one of the key things. And by analyzing also Soviet anti-Semitism, she sort of then comes to the notion of the objective enemy as something that you that keeps the movement going, so to say. So I think that it is basically, to sort of bring it to a conclusion here, is that there are some other critical moments, not just anti-Semitism, that we need to focus on in order to understand sort of the extermination factors. And those are the factors which she is interested in. She's interested in why anti-Semitism led to extermination, or in what ways did anti-Semitism lead to extermination. And one of these critical distinctions she makes is between a vice and a crime. And like she says here, you know, after the commission of one gigantic crime, you could return to something seemingly normal. But this is something that's not operating on crime and punishment, truth, justice, nothing like that. So it's not one gigantic crime, and this is something where you can see clearly in this distinction between social anti-Semitism and political anti-Semitism over and against Nazi anti-Semitism, namely that social discrimination can be a crime. It is, you know, it is something that it's called a hate crime nowadays. And it's something that can still be sort of classified as something in and of itself. And on the other hand, this form of anti-Semitism that's not about the crime, but rather about race, makes it such that there is no way to convert to Christianity. There is no way of, you know, absolvation of a crime or getting out of this situation. And that was true for both Jews and German understanding or Nazi understanding of themselves during this time, which was as a non-Jew. You know, this is also something that was just basically something so complex and something so dependent on so many other forces was made into something very black and white. And it's important today to sort of shine light on this factor, because it continually seems to be that, you know, this is something that all people fall prey to, is making complicated issues appear black and white.